Welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Dr. M.N. Rajesh and I teach at the Department of History in the University of Hyderabad. The name of the module is Discussion on Women's Status in Early India and the name of the paper is Women in History. This particular module tries to explain the historiographical shifts in the representation of women from the 19th century to the contemporary period and the contesting ideas that led to differential representation about the status of women in early India. We begin with the Orientalists who had discovered India and therefore try to imagine India and particularly Indian women from their own European examples and also from their own Eurocentric needs and assumptions. Therefore, a reaction came to the Orientalist perspective, which was also reflected in the composition of later literary texts. This whole gamut of texts continued, and therefore we find departures from the early Orientalist tradition to the contemporary period, which was also largely influenced by Marxism and later by approaches in gender studies and the rise of women's studies. This long journey from the 19th century to the present through a study of the historiographical traditions shall be the core journey or the thread which takes us through this particular journey to explore the situation of women. So we begin with the early Europeans who discovered India. We begin with the Orientalists, which is a very important area of entry to understand not only Indian history but also the status of representation of women in ancient India. This particular representation, or what we call Orientalism or Orientalist writing on ancient Indian history, started in the 19th century when Europeans began to take interest in ancient Indian history. The Orientalists reconstructed the glory of Indian civilization in the past. This was part of a romantic search for a distant, Edenic world, an utopia to escape the bewildering changes taking place in the 19th century. The past was presented as a homogeneous whole without any aberrations. Now, the point to be noted here are two important aspects. First is the Orientalists celebrated the idea of ancient India as a utopian past which was homogeneous, but it was actually totalizing because such a past was destroyed in Europe on account of the rise of large scale changes and the beginnings of nascent industrialization, and therefore European society changed, and therefore they longed to go back to a past and they found this past in India. Secondly, we have used the term romantic. We now see that China was discovered during the period of Enlightenment. The dominant paradigm during the period of Enlightenment was science, and therefore the Europeans wanted to find science in China. India was discovered during the Romantic period, and therefore the dominant paradigm of the Romantic period was the return to an idyllic past. So, therefore, they sought to find in India a world like Eden. So, this was an Edenic search. With having outlined these two important aspects of the Orientalists, we now move on to some of the important personalities associated with this historiographical tradition. The most important persons whose name crops up are William Jones and H.T. Colebrook. William Jones and H.T. Colebrook, closely associated with the Asiatic Society, wrote on a wide-ranging themes of Sanskrit literature, history, philosophy, which were refined and elaborated later. Jones did not pay attention to Sati and in passing mentions Gargi, eminent for her piety and learning. On the other hand, Colebrook gives a textbook position on Sati. Now, William Jones and Colebrook are also important because they function within the institutional patronage of the Asiatic Society. The Asiatic Society, as we all know, was an important center which helped in collection, preservation, and editing of many important texts, inscriptions, and coins, which were the primary historical sources, and it was based in Calcutta. So it was from this base in Calcutta, which was also the political capital of British, that we saw a convergence between both the political ideas and also the cultural reproduction of ancient India. Through this particular institutional base of the Asiatic Society, William Jones set out to write something about ancient India. As we had already seen, that he mentions only in passing. So there is actually a process of selection at work, and this process of selection which William Jones and H.T. Colebrook established became the model for later day writers, or what is called later day Indologists. And among these Indologists we have another important writer known as James Mill, but James Mill marks a certain departure. James Mill deemed Hindu civilization to be very crude because of the status of its women. They excluded women from sacred texts, deprived them of education, a share in paternal property, and were held unworthy to eat with their husbands. Hindu men were effeminate and unfit for self rule. So, this actually comes with a particular type of ideology which is also reflected in the British modality of governance, as Indians were unfit for self rule. Since the Indian natural rulers were the kings, the Maharajas, and then the Nawabs, and also we have the local panchayats headed by men, they were all deemed as effeminate and therefore unfit to rule. Therefore, the European men were endowed with masculinity, whereas the Indian men were deemed as effeminate. And these effeminate men, through the course of centuries, actually deprived their own women of any rights, as they don't find any mention in the sacred texts. And therefore, what happens in this intervention by James Mill, which is crucial and reproduced later, is that a particular utilitarian type of thinking, which was also a branch of ideology, which sought to establish ends based on certain utilities. And therefore, we now see this, the die was cast, and James Mill was one particular important scholar whose works are being quoted again and again, which would have very important consequences that would be questioned only in the 1950s and 60s in India. Moving on from James Mill, we have another important text by Catherine Mayo known as Mother India, which was written in 1927 and provided a detailed and indignant account of the sexual excesses of Indian men and the terrible suffering of the child bride. These sentiments were echoed by many. This text became a bestseller and served the colonial interest. A reviewer in New York Statesman and Nation wrote, Mayo's book made the claim for Swaraj, self government, seem nonsense, and the wish to grant it almost a crime. So, this particular sentence, which said that the whole idea of Swaraj was deemed as some nonsense because the Indians were unfit to rule, clearly unmasks Catherine Mayo's Mother India, showing India in one particular light, that Indians were actually ill treating their women, and therefore the Indian women did not have voice, and therefore she was always singing in the voice of her husband, her father, her brother, or in some other male company. Therefore, now we have another tradition which is slightly a difference from William Jones, who had certain sympathetic understanding, to the utilitarians, to Catherine Mayo. And now we move on to another important voice, which was Max Muller. Max Muller again echoes William Jones but takes the work to a very, very wide canvas. Max Muller was actually German. The extension of Orientalists was facilitated by Max Muller, who collected and published the full text of the Vedas, which was a natural basis for Indian history, as he believed. The Aryans were the true ancestors of our race, though it was difficult to convince the rulers that the subjects were also of the same race. Only passing references to women, and they are not regarded as equal in the Aryan society. Maitri and Yajnavalkya episode are reflected to show that women participated in rituals but were not initiated and not admitted to the highest knowledge of Atma and Brahma. Maitri is an exception. Now, there is an important problem with Max Miller because the idea of race, which was started, was concurrent in Europe, and today we do not use the category of race, but Max Muller freely used the category of race. But Max Muller was also careful to point out that race and language do not have a coterminal interpretation. That is, there is no particular Aryan race which is composed of people speaking the Aryan languages, quote unquote, the early Sanskrit. But this was later ignored or misunderstood by the later writers, while Max Muller also recounted that he had not meant it this way, that there is a correlation between race and language. But race was a category which was very important for Europe. What is more important with Max Muller is Max Muller started publication of certain important volumes, not only the Vedas but also other important texts which we shall talk about later, that became the basis for research on ancient Asia, not only India. We now on move to Mrs. Spare. Spare published a book called Life in Ancient India in 1856. Here she has used the important text, the Manusmriti, and says that on the evidence of Manu, obedience to her husband is the beginning, middle, and end of the female duty. Women's rights are wholly ignored by Brahmanical texts because daughters and wives are too happy to require rights. It gives a lot of importance to conjugal love of Nala Damayanti and Savitri Satyavan. Now, Mrs. Spare talks about texts like the Manusmriti. What happens here is that the Manusmriti is among one of those few texts which now gain a central position in the debates on the idea of the nation, the idea of the Hindu, the idea of religion, the idea of society. Though Manusmriti was not followed literally for many centuries, and there are many regional texts and regional traditions that inform the function of society under the various courts of the kings and different rulers. So Manusmriti again comes to the center stage, and the second idea is that it is interpreted literally, though there are certain portions of it which are actually normative. They only prescribe a particular type of society. These are only normative and prescriptive, but they were deemed to be functioning, and this is where the whole problem lies. This was taken a step further by Clarice Bather, who published Women in Ancient India in 1867. It was influenced by Max Miller. Women are not excluded from rituals, for it is women who collected the kushagras for the sacred enclosure, she says. They had the right to offer sacrifices and compose hymns, is another point echoed by Clarice Bather. But she says that the real fall of women came with the Krishna cult, which was gross and materialistic. With contact of Islam, it became physical and moral degradation to the Indian woman. The law only commanded the woman to identify her life with her husband, but she went further and identified her death with her husband. This seems to be some important intervention, but in the readings of these texts were all jumbled up. At a point, she is right in talking about the shift with the rise of the Krishna tradition, which again is very important because we see that the popularity of Krishna tradition was mainly among the pastoralists and also among the early recipients of the agrarian expansion from the 3rd century AD, when we had large scale agrarian expansion in many parts of northern and western India. Now, what are the lessons for the Western women? Both Clarice Bather wrote about women in Aryan civilization characterized by spiritual and ascetic tenderness, and the second example which we had talked about as a complete denial of self and unlimited devotion to family. The awe-inspiring spiritual courage is evident in the woman who mounts the funeral pyre to commit sati. They were unfettered in Vedic times, could listen to discourse through decorum, but did not permit them to answer them directly. Preference for a son because daughter could not perform funeral rites. Two important aspects here are the idea of sati and funeral rites. Sati was one important aspect which occupied the minds of the colonial administrators, and we had also seen that the earlier writers like James Mill talked about women performing sati, but the idea of sati was that it was not very common and it was confined only to the upper castes and classes, and that too particularly in certain regions like Bengal and Rajputana, which later became part of Rajasthan, and other parts of North India, while it was virtually non-existent in many other parts. The second point is that we have many restrictions on women. Some of them were actually read literally. So it is this contest of literary reading of the text, because these texts were prescriptive and normative. It prescribes that a woman should live for so and so person's duty, that is her father and later her husband, and so live in the shadows. The text also prescribed that a man should be a brahmachari for 20 years, live a life of a grihastha or a married man for another 25 years, and then be a vanaprastha for 25 years and take sannyas for the last 25 years, which assumes that the life of a man is 100 years, but in reality it was much, much less, as the life expectancy was very less in ancient India. So therefore, there is a problem with reading the text in a normative fashion or a prescriptive fashion. But then we have to understand the ideological basis of these texts. What was the ideological basis? We have seen that one of the important text ideological basis was that the typing and typecasting of Indian men and women as unfit for any self role was also concurrent with the European idea that they them only could administer India and the Indians were unfit to administer. We also see that the effort was to make the natives understand that their laws and appreciate the efforts made by the rulers. That is the effort by the writers so that the Indians could understand the laws made by the British. The colonial restructuring of gender and the circular institutionalization of literature both worked to undermine the authority of Indian literature and the societies that gave rise to them. It means that colonialism brought about new forms of knowledge, and these new forms of knowledge brought with them new texts, and these texts delegitimized the earlier texts, saying that the earlier texts were unscientific, the earlier texts did not have any validity, the earlier texts were prescriptive in nature, the earlier texts were harmful to women, etc. Therefore, what colonialism did was, while it restructured the society, it brought about new forms of knowledge, and these new forms of knowledge also proved detrimental to women. And therefore, we have a reading of the past which was homogeneous and which was in a straight line, and colonialism presented it in such a way, and therefore, we now have the idea of Indian women being oppressed for 5,000 years, which was actually a colonial invention because it does not give space for different traditions like the tantric tradition or the women renunciants or the bhakti tradition, which are a very, very important part of Indian culture and civilization. And even today we have many bhakti saints being venerated not only in the homes but also in institutional spaces like temples, etc. So therefore, the dissolution of these disparate traditions into one monolithic homogeneous tradition and time was what was attempted by the early writers. Another point is that though they tried to revive and retrieve and put into circulation many Sanskrit and Persian texts, it was a highly restructured version of the past that emerged. This is an important point because the restructured version of the past meant it was for an audience, and this audience was a Victorian audience. Therefore, the Sanskrit texts were not read in the light of the earlier Sanskritic traditions and also their performative counterparts, but were read in conjunction with the new patrons, that is, the British. It is pertinent again here to return to Max Muller, who started a series called the Sacred Books of the East. The Sacred Books of the East included not only the Vedas, but it also included the Zendavesta of the Zoroastrians, and it also included the I Ching, or the book of the Taoists and the Confucianists, and we have all other important traditions which were translated under the stewardship of Max Muller, who engaged many important writers and collaborators. So this production of knowledge by Max Muller was favorable to the local population, but he committed many mistakes. Some of them were the adoption of certain categories and concepts which were actually serving the European needs unmindful, which was of his own admission. For example, Max Muller imagined ancient India to be a perfect and a peaceful place as represented in the text, because he had read the text literally. Now, we have later other interpretations of these texts, and the other interpretations are not only the Sanskrit interpretations by the Sanskrit scholars, but by the later scholars in the 19th century. Who are they? Many of the Brahmanical texts were interpreted by the scholars who depended on these sources as textual material. These texts are heavily preoccupied with religious and legal questions. Women are viewed mainly in the context of the family, the relationship between husband and wife being the main backdrop. Now, the problem with the bias of the text is that the Brahmanical texts show the inherent bias of the Brahmins. They reflect the precepts of the Brahmins rather than the actual practice of the people. They confine themselves to the upper classes. The nationalist historians like R.C. Majumdar also relied on these texts to paint a picture of golden age in ancient India. A.S. Saltaker was another important historian who also wrote extensively on the same topic, where he suggested that women in ancient India enjoyed a high status. Now, what are these problems? These problems are taken head on in a recent work by Tanika Sarkar titled Hindu Wife, Hindu Nation, in which she talks about the particular type of marriage system that existed in colonial Assam. In the type of marriage which existed in colonial Assam is very different from the type of marriage which exists today in modern Assam, because these were brought about due to the change after the reforms. The earlier type of marriage which existed was a type of association which was based on the local traditions and practices and did not conform to the Sanskrit texts but conform to the local texts and traditions. Each region had some such texts. For example, we had the matrilocal residential pattern among the Nayars of Kerala, who followed a different tradition known as the Marmakattayam tradition. So, but the interpretation of the texts in South India again followed the same Sanskritic text, and therefore all of India was imagined as one under the British, and this imagining was based on the position of women as reflected in the classical texts, and for this they relied on the earlier authors and their translations. Now we have seen the ideological basis and the bias. We now see some of the important themes taken in these texts. One of the important themes taken in this text is the relations. The relations in classical literature focuses primarily on the relation of women to a man in the husband and wife context. Another prominent relation is the mother and child, but here the focus is more on the child rather than on the mother. Now, the question is that we find the idea of the reception of these texts in the modern period starting from the 19th century under the backdrop of Victorian morality. The Victorians imagined a particular type of morality which was in Britain at that particular time, and this was a type of morality which they wished to impose in India and all the other colonies. So, therefore, the reception of these texts followed this morality, which is explained in another theme on chastity. Major myths convey the message that women must be chaste and faithful, and these qualities and virtues can see them through difficult situations and adversity. A wife's devotion generates power which can fight all odds. In addition to this, we also have a large repertoire of myths, and these myths were read literally. For example, the famous myth of Damayanti, who successfully identified her prospective husband from 5 identical men. Savitri, in her devotion, followed Yama, the god of death, to the other world. Arundhati, who transformed her seducer into children. Ahilya could not see through the deception of Indra, and she is punished and made into a stone. So these are some of the important examples. The point is that these examples are all quoted selectively in accordance with the Victorian tradition, because the Victorians wanted a particular type of morality, and this morality therefore negated other experiences. For example, we have not only monogamous marriage, but we also have men with 2 or 3 wives or more, which was normal for kings and many others in ancient India, but these were not highlighted. What was highlighted was that the ideal family was a monogamous family, and then the other types of family were deviations from this, and we get large number of such deviations in the epic literature. And the most important epics today in India are the Ramayana and Mahabharata. Particularly the Ramayana is important because the importance of Ramayana has spread not only from India to the neighboring countries, but also as far as Mongolia in the north and all of Southeast Asia, which is today known as the Ramayana belt. We now focus on some of the important epic characters, particularly the Mahabharata, and how women are portrayed here. They are neither chaste nor passive. Kunti conceives outside marriage. Draupadi is also, in contrast to the image of fidelity to a single male, because she is married to 5. She does not suffer in silence but strongly condemns the Pandavas for the humiliation they have brought on her. She argues with the elders on the legs position of a slave, and argued that since Yudhishthira had gambled away his own person before her, he had already lost his authority over her. Marxists like D.D. Kosambi made a definite impact and suggested that changes in women's status were linked to the changes in production and material relations, which was a very, very important contribution, because we see that the withdrawing of women from the working population, that is from the farm to the household in the 19th century, led to their domesticity. Similarly, the rights of women in tribal societies were more egalitarian, because the idea of private property was not enforced strongly. So, D.D. Kosambi's idea of history as stages in the changes in production patterns and their impact on women marks a very important intervention. This was taken forward by other Marxist scholars and also other important writers and historians like Romila Thapar, Suvira Jaiswal, Kumkum Roy, who elaborated on these themes and showed how texts in ancient India were reinterpreted. and most important among them is Romila Thapar's Shakuntala, which talks about the reinterpretation of Shakuntala in many different traditions and for many different audiences, and how these audiences were constituted by certain important initiatives. What were the initiatives? And she says that the desire largely being political. The discussion on status of women in early India started with the Orientalists and their idea of ancient India, which was widely circulated in Europe and later written as part of the histories of India and other countries. So the Orientalist impact on Indian history writing has been massive, and what has happened is that the reception of the Orientalists was smooth till the 1920s, and it was this reception that created an image of India with women in a certain position. And all this rested on the discovery of India during the Romantic period. Indian women were seen in two contrasting positions, one according to the writers like Max Miller and William Jones, and secondly, according to other writers like James Mill, who saw Indian women as subjugated and Hindu civilization as crude. They, they did not make any attempt to look at the relations between the production process and the changing laws, nor did they make any connection between the regional practices and the importance of texts. It was primarily concentrated on Sanskritic texts and Brahmanical texts interpreted from one particular viewpoint, which did not make sense to the large mass of Indians living in different cultural zones and following different cultural practices, and also, more importantly, different stratified sections of society. Therefore, we have new readings which were initiated by D.D. Kosambi, which was a challenge to the nationalist school by R.C. Majumdar and A.S. Altekar, who glorified ancient India based on the writings of Max Muller, who had started the series on sacred books of the East. R.C. Majumdar's idea of the Golden Age mirrors the idea of Golden Age in many of the societies like China, which talked about the Tang dynasty as the Golden Age. Here, the Gupta dynasty was in the apogee of the Hindu civilization. And similarly, D.D. Kosambi, while unpacking this from a Marxist perspective, also opened the doors for later scholars. Most important among them were Swera Jaiswal, Romila Thapar, and Kumkum Roy, who had written extensively on women and their position in ancient India, and have represented that how these positions, changing roles and status of women, were actually conversant with the changing material world around them, particularly the property relations among them. With this, we come to an end, and I thank you.